All right, well, we're going to get this thing down on tape anyhow, so we'll get started this morning. We're going to be picking up today with starting in chapter 18 now, and now we're getting towards the very, very tail end of Jesus' life, literally the last few hours, and so our next section is going to be focusing in on his arrest, his trial, his sentencing, and then his execution. And that's where we're going to be for the next few weeks. Now, these events are among the very few that are talked about in all four Gospels. We've talked a lot about how unique John's Gospel is and John's presentation is, and how almost everything in the Gospel that he tells us about isn't told anywhere else. But there are a handful of things. Nowhere is that more noticeable than in this section of the text. But nonetheless, John still has his special slant on things. And so as we go through this, we have to remember once again that the other Gospels were all completed and circulated before John's was done. So as John writes he's using the other writings as backdrop. And he's making an assumption that people are familiar with most of the story already. But he has something unique to say. So as we go into this, our goal is going to be, our focus is going to be on uncovering what John is trying to present about these events and what's the uniqueness of John's story. We're not going to be spending a whole lot of time trying to reconcile all of the different gospel stories and versions, because that would be a class unto itself that would last another 78 weeks. So we're not going to get into that very much. So with that as a background, let's take a look at what the setting is now as we enter into chapter 18. And you want to remember, first of all, that this is the beginning of Passover week. That will continue. It's not just a single day. It's a holiday that extends. It's a feast day that extends for a full week. And this is a celebration, of course, of the deliverance of Israel in their history and their deliverance, particularly from their Egyptian captivity. The city, Jerusalem, is bursting at the seams because so many pilgrims have shown up there for the special feast day. And so it's crowded, it's bustling with activity. There's a Roman fortress in Jerusalem. It's on the northeastern aspect of the city, and that fortress would be on high alert at this time because of all the crowds and the congestion. And this is a very volatile situation. So the Roman soldiers, the Roman garrison is on high alert, and they know that there's going to be some risky periods coming up in the next few days because there's so much heightened activity in the area. At this particular moment, the Jewish people, which would include both the residents of Jerusalem and those who are visiting, they have just now concluded their Passover evening activities. Okay, their meal, their beginning of their religious observances, that is settling down. They're starting to disperse to their homes. Many are preparing to go on to the temple later that night, because what happened at midnight of Passover was they threw the gates to the temple open and people would go there for worship. And so the Jewish people are still in town. There's a lot of things going on. I guess I was thinking about this a little bit. It might be like the 4th of July, and you try to get to bed, and there's still this stuff happening everywhere, you know. And I just want to go to sleep, but the fireworks are still going off and everything. Well, there's a lot of activity going on in Jerusalem. This is not the norm for them. But meanwhile, Jesus with his disciples, they have been sequestered in this upper room. And that could have been in the home of a disciple or possibly a relative of one of the 11 in the room. And that could have made this upper room available to them. And they've been up there for the whole evening. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the events of that evening, but just suffice it here to say it's already been a long evening. But in reality, it's just started. Okay, so this is going to be a long night. And so now from this upper room, this small group decides to leave. And where are they heading as they leave that upper room?
Temple.
No? Where's Jesus taking his guys? Again. The garden. Yeah, they're headed to Gethsemane. Okay, this will be the Gethsemane moment. Now, outside the city walls, on the east side of Jerusalem, and I thought about trying to put a map up, but I didn't get one, but I think you can imagine it in your head. Out to the east of the city, directly across the city wall from the temple, is this ridge. And it's known as the Mount of Olives, but it's really not a mountain. It's more of a big ridge that extends sort of oriented north and south along parallel to the city wall. On the near side of that ridge is an olive grove, okay? On the far side of that ridge is a little town called Bethany that we've talked about because Lazarus and Mary and Martha lived there, and that was a convenient place for Jesus to stop as he was either coming to Jerusalem or as he was leaving Jerusalem. So that was a convenient place for them. But Gethsemane, which means oil press, got its name because the olives that they would harvest there in the groves were pressed at that location. And that is where part of the activities of the evening take off next. Now there are some phrases that we see in the text here, and we're in chapter 18. There are some phrases here that indicate that this place that they went to was a very discreet place, a specific place, and it may have been walled off, if you think about how they describe it. Verse 1 of chapter 18, it says they went into the olive grove, okay? And then if you read on, it says in verse 3, Judas came to the grove, and in verse 4 it says Jesus went out to meet those who were coming to arrest him. So it's been guessed that there may well have been a walled portion of this garden that they went into. Now this was a familiar place for the group. They went there often. And verse 2 is going to tell us that Jesus had often met there with his disciples. But if you go over to Luke, in Luke chapter 21 and verse 37, we learn that Jesus had spent nights there in this olive grove in Gethsemane. He had spent nights there with his disciples, and they had done that already this week. The week of following Jesus' entry into the city of Jerusalem. And then in Luke 22:39, Luke mentions on the same evening as Jesus is going to be arrested, Luke says he went out as usual to the Mount of Olives. So this is a place where Jesus and his disciples went frequently. They may well have spent the night there. Again, this may have been property owned by a disciple, and they felt like this was a safe place that they could retreat to out of the way, spend the night, and then make their way back into the city the next day. So that's some background for where we're headed here. And now we're going to take a look at the text. So the key thing that I want for us to see as we work our way through the text with regards to the arrest here is how poised Jesus is. He is in control of the situation. Even though it seems like he's the victim, he really is the one in control. And watch how John points that out. Watch how he points out Jesus' confidence and his assertiveness as we walk through this. And it's not going to end there. We're going to see it in his arrest, but we're going to see it continue through the whole trial. Okay? So, here we go. We're going to read chapter 18, verses 1 through 12. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. And when Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And again he asked them, who is it you want? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. I told you that I am he, Jesus answered. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. And then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? And then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him. We'll stop there for right now. So back to the top, let's take a look at this text in a little more detail. First of all, verse 1. The NIV says when he'd finished praying, but literally the words there are, having said these things. And so it's probably shouldn't be limited just to Jesus' prayer. It's probably referring to the verbiage of the entire evening, the farewell discourse and then the farewell prayer. That's probably what's being referenced here, rather than just, as NIV says, the prayer itself. It's probably the whole thing. In verse 3, we meet the arrest party. And interestingly, it says Judas was guiding them in the NIV, but some of the translations say leading them. He wasn't leading them in the sense that he had authority over the soldiers. He was not in charge here. He was serving as their advanced scout, the guy who had the inside information and knew where to go. In all likelihood, they'd gone first to the upper room because Judas had left. Jesus had dismissed him from the upper room, and Judas didn't know for sure that they'd left there. But if they went to the upper room first and found it empty, then Judas would say, aha, I know where they went. And so then they would make that stop too. So in all likelihood, that's what was going on. The arrest party consisted then of two different groups, two armed groups. The first group is a detachment of soldiers with their commander. And we see the commander that's mentioned in verse 12. Okay, he's not mentioned at the beginning, but he's mentioned down in verse 12. The term that's used to describe this group of soldiers is a cohort. And then the term that's used for the word commander is a triliarch. Both of those are Roman terms, which makes one think or imagine that this was then a Roman contingent of soldiers. Okay? Now that's important for two reasons. Number one, it's important because the Jewish leaders who are pressing for Jesus' arrest, it means they had to get a Roman official to sign off on using his soldiers. So, and then who would that official be? Well, Pilate would have been the governor and the one who would have ultimately authorized the use of his soldiers. And so that may give us an idea why when Pilate comes onto the scene, he already has an inkling of what's going on here and what the Jews are up to. Plus, he's had time to talk about this at home with his wife, and his wife has been upset about what's going on. John doesn't tell us that part of the story, but you know it, and it's in the other, in I think Luke, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, Pilate sort of has this inside information already in advance of when Jesus is formally brought to him for a verdict, okay? So that's the reason, number one, that this is important. Idea number two, and the reason that it's important, is it gives us an idea of how concerned these guys were about Jesus. As you and I know, Jesus is not a threat. And certainly not a threat to Rome in the sense that everybody's concerned about here. But nonetheless, they are concerned about it because they've just witnessed a few days ago how Jesus entered the city and the masses were just head over heels for this guy. So they know that as they go to arrest him, they don't know what they're going to run into. This may be a real mess, okay? And so they use this Roman force to help. But the second group that's there, according to the text, again in verse 3, is called the officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Now this would have been a Jewish group, okay? And literally, the words mean the officers of the Jews. So likely this was a small police force, maybe the temple guard, and they certainly weren't allowed to have the power or the clout that the Roman force would have had. But these guys were primarily responsible, if it was the temple guard, they were responsible for just protecting the temple. Rome wanted the temple protected because if the temple got attacked, that would cause an uprising in the city. They knew that. These Jews cared about their temple. And so the Romans allowed for the Jews to have their own security force, their own security detail to deal with their, what Rome viewed as trivial religious issues. And so that was the second group that was also present. So the interesting thing here is that we see the Jews and the Romans working together. Normally, the Jews and the Romans were like oil and water. The Jews hated the Roman occupation. But nonetheless, you're sort of seeing what comes true when the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, right? And it's not that they necessarily have a lot of friendship, but they have a common interest here and a common enemy. And that's the point. Okay, verse 4, we see Jesus taking control of the situation. And this is part of John's unique slant on this. John makes a comment. He said Jesus knew all that was going to happen to him. Now, how did John know that? How did John know that? Well, because he saw what Jesus did. He saw Jesus take steps to defuse this situation and to protect his own disciples. And that's what Jesus goes ahead and does. And John said he knew what was happening. He knew what was going to happen, and he could see that, and this is the way Jesus acted. Go ahead, Jamie.
Also, at the Last Supper, he tells Peter and Simon that he's going to, this is later that he's writing this, and all of those things are coming back to him.
Right.
He knows that
Right.
everything.
And that's going to be the message John brings to us, is that this just unfolded according to the script. This was the script, and it was followed to the T. And that's how John's going to see this thing playing out, and that's how he writes it, and that's how we need to see it playing out, right?
He's also the one that asked Jesus who was the betrayer.
That's right.
And
That's right.
explain this.
Yep. Yes, sir.
And another thing, all through this time together with them, with Jesus, they've watched him control all situations, and the fact that he knew things before they happened.
Right.
It's not beyond, belief that even in this, he's well aware of what's going to take place.
So John mentions this because he wants that testimony to be heard. He wants us to see that Jesus was indeed in control of the situation. Okay, verse 5. How does Jesus identify himself here? And the he doesn't belong there. It's another I am moment.
Wow.
Okay? Who do you seek? Jesus of Nazareth, I am. Notice also as Jesus responds to that, notice the comments that John makes about Judas now. It sounds almost personal.
The traitor.
He says, Judas the traitor. Judas is going to go down in history for this, and John doesn't hesitate to stamp the label on him, does he? And then the other thing that he says is Judas stood there with them. This is the first time Judas has really stood on the other side. He's been pretending the whole time, but now he's taken his place, and he's identifying with the guys with whom he really belongs.
And that's what I was going to say is that in this moment, John is hurt because of what Judas is doing to somebody that they all love very much. And that's why he's really coming down on him now with this whole traitor thing. Is he's separating them from Judas, saying, hey, this guy did something that we are really upset with him about.
And I want to say something that's parallel to that, because it's a position I find myself in as I read this and this account and as I study it and as we work our way through the trial and then into the crucifixion, is it just as John reacted humanly and being hurt, we react defensively as we're going through this trial, we look at all the injustices and everything that are going to happen, and we're going to see they're just right and left. It's all over the place. But it was the script. This was what the Father wanted to happen. This had to happen, and it had to happen for our good and for our benefit. So I find myself a little bit torn on that as well, just as I'm sure John did in his feelings towards Judas. You know, I find myself torn. I want Jesus to be defended, but on the other hand, I need him on that cross. You know? And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Verse 6, what was their reaction when Jesus identifies himself? They drew back and down to the ground.
So
Why do you think they added the he? Because
It's just to clarify it. It's just to clarify, but the word is not there originally, yes. Yeah. But remember, some of these guys are Romans. The Jews in the group certainly would react to the I am statement.
So they worship. They didn't. Is that what you're saying?
They may have. That may have been an element. I doubt it because of the situation that they're in, but they certainly felt respect. And remember, these soldiers are under a command. They have to follow what their boss says, even if they personally are not involved with it. But I think there's another reason that these guys drew back and fell down, because we have to explain why the Romans did that too. And I think the reason is because when they went to that olive grove that night, they were looking for a guy who would be on the run, who would be hiding from them. And then instead of that, here comes Jesus striding out to meet them, and he asks the questions.
Yeah.
And he says, "You looking for me? Here I am. Take me." You know, and that causes you to step back a little bit. This guy has a bearing. He has an authority that is different than anybody else. This is not what we expected. We thought we brought torches. We brought weapons. We're thinking that we're going to have to go chase him down, find him. He's hiding somewhere. And this is going to be a wild goose chase for most of the night before we find him. Instead, Jesus strides out and presents himself to them. It's pretty impressive when you think about it. And it had to be a very impressive moment for them. Craig.
You could also add to that, he asks, who is it you want? He knows they're looking for some person specific.
That's right.
He could be out there for any reason.
That's right.
He knows why.
He knows why they're out there. Sure.
And that has to make them go, wow.
Yep. So there are a lot of reasons, but Jesus, just his overall bearing in this situation, and again, this is something we see through the entire trial and into the crucifixion. This is something that Jesus carries with him the whole way. Okay, verses 7 and 8, they replay the script a second time. It's almost as if they didn't get it the first time. And they ask the same question, or Jesus asks the same question. They give the same answer, and Jesus gives the same answer back to them. But what has happened now by Jesus going through this question and answer twice is what he's doing is he's defending his disciples. He's pointing out to everybody that's there, I'm the one you're after. Focus on me. Don't worry about these guys. Okay? Focus on me. I'm the one that you want. He's helped them come to that conclusion by what he has said. And so Jesus is, as always, in charge of the situation. He's directing the traffic here. In verse 9, John points out that when Jesus did these things and he protected his own disciples, that he was actually fulfilling a promise that he had made. And that was all the way back in chapter 6 and verse 39 when he said, I have not lost any that you have given to me. Okay? And so when he said that, now it's being fulfilled. The interesting part of this is that many times in John's gospel, he will say, this happened to fulfill the prophecy, blank, blank, blank. But this time it's not a prophecy by an Old Testament prophet. Now John is using Jesus' own words as a prophecy to be fulfilled. So he's linking Jesus right together with all of those others who delivered accurate messages from God the Father. All those prophets of old. Okay, verse 10, Peter acts out again. The word for sword here is a small sword, one that could easily be concealed under a cloak or a tunic. It's more like probably a dagger than an actual sword you'd wave around. John is the only author to name either Peter or Malchus, while the other gospel writers all mention the event, but they don't give us names. And that's important because, again, John is just lending credibility to himself as an eyewitness of this thing. And he's saying that's who it was. And in the late part of the first century, if you really wanted to check it out, you could go back to Malchus's family and ask them, because I'll bet they knew the story of what happened in the garden when his ear was cut off and then it wasn't off anymore. You know?
Well, that was my thought. With John given this much detail, I think the putting of the ear back on by Jesus would have been monumental to those that came to arrest him.
Right. Right.
Like, do we really want to mess with this guy?
Exactly. Yeah. And anybody that wanted to go back and ask those questions was going to come face to face with the miracle that Jesus did.
Yeah, one more.
There's no way to get around that. If you want to go ask him about the story, you're going to hear it. You're going to hear the whole thing. You're not going to hear just the part when his ear was cut off. In verse 11, Jesus and Peter are sort of butting heads again. Okay? Peter has just made this clumsy attempt to defend Jesus. But Jesus says, "No, Peter, I am committed to drink what he calls the cup my Father has given to me." And this language is as close as we get in John to what the other gospel writers, what the synoptics speak of happening in the garden. Because remember Jesus' prayer in the garden? What was his prayer?
That, Lord, if there's any way to remove it.
To remove what? This cup. And that's what he called it in the other gospel accounts. And now John references that. He says, Jesus says, I have to drink the cup the Father has given me. He has come to that full resolution. As we were reading through the prayer, the farewell prayer, I want you to link this to verse 19, where Jesus said in his prayer, he had just said a little while ago, for them, for his disciples, I sanctify myself. I set myself aside for this purpose, that they may be sanctified. And we said that was for him setting himself aside for the purpose of going to that cross, so that they could be redeemed ultimately. And that's what's being occurring now as Jesus commands Peter, and he uses that same language. He says, I have to drink the cup the Father has given to me. I am sanctifying myself. I am committed to this. That is the only thing of importance right now. Okay, and then in verse 12, we see that Jesus was arrested and bound. Obviously, it wasn't necessary to bind Jesus. He presented himself. He was going to that cross no matter what. But they bound him. Perhaps it was a reaction to what Peter had just done, and they didn't want any more acting out or something like that. But they did bind Jesus. It's interesting to me that Peter wasn't arrested. It's interesting to me that Peter wasn't arrested. And I think there are two actions of Jesus that made that not happen. Number one, we don't read about it in John, but we've talked about it, and that is he healed Malchus. Any cause to arrest Peter, when that came up for review and trial, ultimately they were going to hear about the healing and Jesus putting the ear back on. And that would overweigh whatever they thought about taking the ear off.
Never
So
thought about why they didn't.
yeah, that's number one. But number two, they also saw Jesus reprimand Peter. And Jesus used his authority to put Peter in his rightful place. He said, don't get in my way. This is the direction we have to go here. And so perhaps those are reasons that Peter wasn't treated differently. Later on, as we get into Peter's denials, remember this, because that's the backdrop of his denial. And when we get into Caiaphas's house, where this is all taking place, and Peter denies Jesus, John is there too, but John doesn't seem to be threatened. Peter feels very threatened. Maybe part of that is because he had taken the dagger and lopped off the guy's ear. And one of those guys has a relative who's accusing him of it. Okay, so there's more than meets the eye to that. All right, now we move into the trial. I have no idea where I am here. Jesus on trial. Yeah, good. The trial extends really from the middle of chapter 18 through the end of the middle of chapter 19. And there are two major phases of Jesus' trial. There's the Jewish phase first, and then there's the Roman phase. We're going to try to get at least the background in on those right now. The Jewish phase is the first phase, and that was instigated by Jesus' enemies. It's their hatred for Jesus that is driving this whole process forward. The Romans couldn't care less. Okay, they just don't want a problem. But otherwise they leave the Jews to their religious bickering. You know, that's sort of their thought. The Great Sanhedrin is the Jewish ruling council, and it consisted of 70 and was chaired by the high priest, or the high priest was its presiding officer. It was primarily by this time a religious body with only religious jurisdiction because Rome had limited their power. They took away some of their ability to rule because Rome didn't want them making all of the big decisions or the important decisions. But Rome did allow this body to govern the religious and the social activities of first century Palestine, including things like maintaining the temple, temple taxation was an important thing, the enforcement of the religious law. Those things were all things that fell under the purview then of the Sanhedrin. But Rome would not allow them to take over or rule over Rome's primary interests. These are things like the military control, who was really in charge, the national leadership, who were appointed to the key offices and things like that. That was all under Rome. Rome imposed a tremendous burden of taxation upon their other states throughout the empire. A tremendous burden of taxation, and that was administered by Rome. Rome did not allow, and this is important for our purposes, they did not allow capital punishment to be practiced by the Jews themselves. And that makes sense because Rome doesn't want Jews arresting and then putting to death Roman sympathizers. Their friends, you know, the Romans who are helping, or the Jews who are helping Rome lead the country. So they don't want the Sanhedrin plucking those people off. And so they have taken away the Jewish ability to sentence people to death. That's the first part of the trial, the Roman phase of the Jewish phase of the trial. Then we're going to move into a Roman phase of the trial. And when we get to that phase, go ahead, Lamar.
Well, in that statement you just made, it makes me think now, on several occasions, the Bible said they sought to kill Jesus. On one occasion, at least, they were stoning, but the stoning was not just throwing rocks at him, it was with the intent of killing. I wonder why they would even begin to think about doing that if they knew that they were breaking Roman law to do it.
There's been a lot of controversy about whether the fact that Jews could not execute applied to stoning for religious purposes, because we also see them stoning Stephen later on. Okay? So there's been a lot of questions asked about that. I'm not really prepared, honestly, to go into it or go through it.
The woman they brought to Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, there's other situations that we see where stoning is still, and it's prescribed in the Old Testament, clearly.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's an issue. So there may well have been, and part of the problem here, part of the challenge is finding what historical records can give us on that information for this particular point in time, because it could change over time. You might find a historical record, for example, from Josephus later in the 1st century, but we don't know if that applied necessarily to this moment at this particular point in time. So the historians have kind of gone back and forth on that question, but it seems clear that they could not execute by crucifixion for sure. That was reserved for Rome clearly. But there may have been, at different points in time, there may have been exceptions for their ability to stone people for religious purposes.
But it also spoke to why they had to get Pilate involved in this
Yeah.
in order to get Jesus crucified.
That's right, and that's where we're going with this, is that the Roman phase of this trial is not personally directed at Jesus at all. It's directed at the Jews. That's what it's all about, is Pilate going to give in to what they want to do? That's really where that whole question is going. Jamie?
And also, when you were saying Roman sympathizers or whatever, Matthew was a tax collector. So Matthew wasn't led by the Jews.
That's right.
He worked for Rome.
Yeah.
So that, those interactions that are going on.
Yeah, you think about this collection of people, and you've got, on one hand, you've got Matthew, a Roman sympathizer, getting wealthy, getting rich off what's going on. And then on the other hand, you've got a zealot in the group who's a revolutionary fighting against Rome. And these two guys have to get along. And Jesus, of course, fixed that. Okay, let's see if I wanted to say anything about, just to sort of summarize the Roman phase of the trial. Jesus had not done anything directly to offend Rome, but the Jews wanted a capital sentence. They wanted the death penalty here, and that would require Roman judgment. And the text tells us that, so we can be certain of that they had to have Roman consent in order to put Jesus to death. So at least at this point in time, that's how things stood. So therefore, the trial had to get to a Roman authority at some point. Now, John's perspective, as we listen to him describe the situation, again, watch for Jesus to be in complete control of the situation. It does, the accused is not supposed to do that. Doesn't normally do that. But Jesus, of course, commands everything. Nothing happens in this record without Jesus' knowledge, his consent, and even his directing it. All right. So the Jewish trial is described in chapter 18, verses 13 through 27. But there are a couple of points where it gets interrupted to talk about what's going on with Peter. Okay, so what's happening here really runs from verse 13 through 27. This Jewish trial consists of 3 separate parts. The first part is a hearing before Annas. This is not a formal trial. There are no witnesses brought. It's just questioning. And this shows up only in John's gospel. Okay? It's not anywhere else. The second part of the trial doesn't show up in John's gospel, is only from the synoptics. And the second part is when, after the questioning by Annas, then Jesus is taken to Caiaphas and at least part of the Sanhedrin. Okay? That is, as I said, not described by John, but it shows up in the synoptics. And then the third part of the trial is when, in the early morning hours, the full Sanhedrin has convened, and now they reach their verdict on how they are going to approach the Roman authorities with Jesus and what charges, how they're going to play their hand to Rome. Okay, and so that's the third part. And again, John says nothing about that. So John's focus here is solely upon the first part of this trial, the part that's a questioning by Annas. Now, so who are the cast of characters that we're going to meet in this Jewish phase of the trial? Well, we've talked about the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the group of 70 led by the current high priest, and it was made up of both Sadducees and Pharisees. Annas, 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 was the former high priest. The text tells us. And historians tell us that he held the high priesthood somewhere from about 6 to 15 AD. Of course, this is now about 30 AD. Annas was the high priest, but he was taken out of his role by the Roman governor before Pilate. And we don't know from historians exactly why that happened, why he was taken out of that specific role. But the high priesthood remained in his family. He had 5 sons that succeeded him as high priest, and eventually his son-in-law, who was Caiaphas, succeed him as high priest. There may well have been a grandson to follow that. Historians aren't completely sure. But the point is, Annas was the patriarch of this most influential family of Judea. He was, for lack of a better term, the godfather. That's Annas, and that's his role. And it may well have been actually an advantage to be the ex-high priest, because then you don't have everybody pointing at you, but you still have a lot of the benefits of being the high priest. First of all, his reputation amongst the people. Many Jews, since Rome had kicked him out of office, many of the Jews probably still viewed Annas as the legitimate high priest. Okay? Ever hear about that happening in politics before? You know? But it points to how divided this nation and this situation is, and how much tension there is, how volatile it is. It also helps us remember that nothing's new under the sun. So the high priest may well have enjoyed the reputation amongst the people. He also may have actually behind the scenes been directing most of the activities of the priesthood. He may have been its de facto leader in making the decisions and then just ushering them through his sons, his son-in-law, his grandson, etc. He may well have been empowered to make the appointments to the important offices for the Jews that they were allowed to do. And then, maybe most of all, he would have enjoyed great wealth. You remember when we talked about Jesus cleansing the temple, about all the abuses that were going on, the extra taxes, the high prices, the recycling of insufficient animals that weren't fit for sacrifice, all those practices. Who did they profit? It went in Annas' pockets. That's where this is all going, is to the high priest and his family.
Personal vendetta.
What's that?
Yeah, personal vendetta.
Yeah. This is personal for him. Jesus tried to take him out of place, you know. And so Annas is a guy of tremendous influence. And even though that part is not even mentioned in the synoptics, John wants us to see that. He wants to see this tension between Annas and Jesus. So Jesus was a direct threat to Annas, and then Annas was probably the real power behind Caiaphas in the later proceedings of that night. And maybe that's why John doesn't really go into detail with those, because for John, he's looking at what happens between Jesus and Annas as being determinant. That's what's going to really fix the outcome. But the next player is Caiaphas. And Caiaphas was the current high priest. He was a son-in-law of Annas. And John wants us to see his role, not just here in this trial, but John connects him to the plot. Remember a few chapters back, it was in chapter 11, verses 49 through 51, and there was somebody who said, it's better that one man die for the nation than the whole nation perish. Who was that? Caiaphas. That was Caiaphas who had hatched this whole plot against Jesus. And so that's how John identifies Caiaphas. He wants us to remember that. Okay? But otherwise, John doesn't mention Caiaphas' role in the trial itself. So, we're going to start working our way through this. We're not going to get very far, but let's read at least verses 12 through 14, which they don't really get into the trial, but they introduce what's going, or they don't really get into Annas' questioning, but they sort of introduce it. Verses 12 through 14, the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish official arrested Jesus. They bound him, and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. So John just simply wants to get these players on the table so we know who they are, who they were. But this also lets us know, in the way that he references Caiaphas, that this plot had already been hatched. This lets us know that Jesus is not going to get a fair trial. This thing is already determined. It's been in the minds of these guys for a while now, and it's been working toward its completion. And John is letting us know that even though Jesus is in control of this, it's not going to be fair. The outcome is already decided. They just had to figure out how they were going to do it.
Aaron?
Yes, sir.
You mean political manipulation isn't just new here?
No, nothing new under the sun. Verse 13, where it says Caiaphas was the high priest that year, that's not saying that they had an election or they changed it every year. That's just saying at that point in time, Caiaphas was the high priest. That's what that phrase means. Sometimes you can think that, oh, it looks like they rotate this office. No, that wasn't it. It's just that he was the high priest at that time. Okay, I think we need to probably wrap it up here. We'll pick up next
Did
week.
some of the translations say it that way at that time? Because, yeah, it makes you think that when you're reading this.
Yeah. No, I don't think they do. It's just more understanding the idiom of the Greek. I do think the translation is literally that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. You know how we say things that don't really, if you listen to the individual words, you think, wait a minute, that doesn't mean that. I can't think of an example. Anybody think of what's an idiom? Anybody think of one? A good one?
Break a leg.
Break a leg. Yeah, you're not asking them really to break a leg, are you? You just want to have a good show. There you go. Good.
So
Thank you.
silly.
Thank you.
So it doesn't make sense.
Okay, so next week we'll pick up with this Jewish phase of the trial, or the preliminary hearing, and then starting after that, we'll be taking a look at Peter's adventures, and then we'll get into the Roman phase of the trial. So, okay. Thank you. God is good.